The wind in Santa Lucia, New Mexico territory, never truly rested. In the year of 1889, it was a constant presence, a sculptor of the high desert landscape. It swept dust from the cracked bed of the arroyo, the seasonal creek that gave the town its lifeline and its greatest threat. The wind whispered through the spiny arms of yucca and cholla cactus, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that never fell. It polished the vast, aching blue of the sky until it seemed thin enough to shatter. The town itself was a small collection of sun-baked adobe and weathered wood huddled against this immensity. A simple wooden chapel whose cross tilted ever so slightly. A saloon that was never quiet. A general store, a granary. And the sprawling cattle pens that marked the edge of civilization before the land rolled out toward the distant, blood-red peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Into this place of hard edges and stark light walked Elena Alvarez. She was 24 years old, with eyes that held the memory of softer places and a past that the wind of Santa Lucia had twisted into a cruel fiction. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. They said she had been a singer, a dance hall girl, in a saloon in El Paso. The words painted pictures of painted lips and easy virtue. A fallen woman who had come to their God-fearing town to spread her particular brand of poison. The truth was a quieter, sadder thing. Elena was the widow of a miner, a good man named Mateo who had promised her a life away from the dust and the dark. He had gone into the earth one morning and never come out, the victim of a collapsed tunnel that had left her with little more than a wedding band and a heart full of hollow spaces. All she wanted now was a life of her own making. A life of quiet dignity. She possessed a quick mind and nimble fingers, hoping to support herself by teaching the children of the town their letters or by taking in mending. An honest life, paid for with honest work. That was the dream she carried, as fragile as a desert flower. Watching the town from a distance, both literally and figuratively, was Jackson Cole. At 35, he was the master of the Double C Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that made him the wealthiest man in the territory. His fortune, built on longhorns and a shrewd investment in a small but productive copper mine, gave him an authority he rarely used. He was a tall, quiet man, built of the same tough, resilient material as the land itself. He had buried his wife years ago, a fever taking her in the heat of a brutal summer, and the loss had settled deep inside him, silencing a smile that had once come more easily. Now, his words were few, but when Jackson Cole spoke, men listened. Each word was measured, weighed, and true. He watched the goings-on in Santa Lucia with a calm, discerning gaze, his face giving away nothing of the thoughts that moved behind his steady eyes. The whispers that tormented Elena had a source, a central voice that amplified the fears and prejudices of the town. That voice belonged to Abigail Webb, the wife of the town banker and the self-appointed guardian of its moral purity. She was the president of the Santa Lucia Temperance and Morality Society, a group of women whose stated mission was to uphold virtue, but whose true purpose often seemed to be the wielding of judgment as a weapon. Beneath their pronouncements of piety lay a current of envy and a thirst for control. And in Elena Alvarez, Abigail saw a perfect target. Elena was an outsider, vulnerable, with a past easily molded into a cautionary tale. Elena felt their judgment like a physical barrier. She had rented the cheapest room available, a small, stuffy space behind the general store, its one window looking out onto a dusty alley. When she offered to teach reading and writing to any child who wished to learn free of charge, the mothers of Santa Lucia had closed ranks, one by one. Doors were politely but firmly shut in her face. Abigail Webb had made the rounds, her voice a sweet poison. Speaking of protecting the children from an unwholesome influence, at the market, vendors suddenly became too busy to serve her. She was told, with feigned regret, that her presence in the chapel on Sunday might be a distraction for the men, that it would be more considerate of her to pray at home. Each rejection was a stone added to the wall being built around her. The blowing sand felt like the town's collective opinion, stinging and inescapable. The dry arroyo became a symbol of the town's heart, where trust and compassion had run dry. The spark that would set this dry tinder ablaze came on a Tuesday morning. The news spread from the saloon to the smithy to the front porch of the general store. The town's flood relief fund, a small collection of 10 gold coins kept in a locked box in the granary, was gone. It was money set aside for the day the arroyo inevitably raged, a small measure of security against the caprice of the desert storms. In the middle of the dusty main street, Abigail Webb found her stage. She gathered a crowd with the sheer force of her indignation, her voice ringing with certainty. She declared that she had been unable to sleep the night before and had seen a figure moving in the shadows near the granary. "A woman," she said, her eyes sweeping over the assembled faces and landing, with theatrical precision, on Elena, who had just stepped out of the general store, a woman in a plain brown dress, just like the one Elena wore. The accusation hung in the hot, still air. Sheriff Harlan, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced with jelly, hurried toward the scene. He was a man perpetually indebted to the bank owned by Abigail's husband, a fact that weighed heavily on his every decision. He approached Elena not with the authority of the law, but with the unease of a man caught between his duty and his debts. He cleared his throat and mumbled something about needing her to answer a few questions, his eyes darting everywhere but at her face. That night, sleep offered Elena no escape. She tossed and turned, the injustice of the accusation a bitter taste in her mouth. She woke before dawn, drawn by a faint scraping sound on her porch. Peeking through her curtain, she saw nothing but the empty, moonlit alley. When she finally opened her door to greet the pale light of morning, she found it. Sitting just beside her stoop was a small leather pouch. Her heart pounded against her ribs. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside, glinting with a malevolent light, lay 10 gold coins. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. It was a trap. Someone had not only stolen the money, but had planted it here to ensure her guilt. Her mind raced. To hide it would be an admission of that guilt. To keep it was impossible. There was only one thing to do, one path for an honest person to take. She had to turn it in, to show them she had nothing to hide. Clutching the pouch so tightly her knuckles turned white, Elena walked directly to the sheriff's office. The town was already awake, and her hurried steps drew curious glances. She found Sheriff Harlan polishing his badge, a task he seemed to perform whenever a real duty was required. She placed the pouch on his desk, her voice shaking slightly as she explained where she had found it. "This is the town's money," she said, her voice clear despite her fear. "Someone left it on my porch." Instead of relief, the sheriff's face clouded with suspicion. He looked from the pouch to her, and then to the small crowd that had already gathered at his doorway, drawn by the unfolding drama. Abigail Webb was at the forefront, her arms crossed, a smug, knowing look on her face. The whispers began immediately, louder this time, more certain. "What a performance," someone muttered. "She sees she is caught and now pretends to be a hero. A convenient discovery," another voice added. The crowd swelled, their faces a mixture of scorn and morbid curiosity. They saw not an act of integrity, but a desperate, clumsy piece of theater. In their eyes, her attempt to return the money was the final, damning proof of her deceit. Elena stood frozen in the center of the room, the single object of their collective scorn. She looked from face to face, searching for a flicker of doubt, a glimmer of belief, but found only cold condemnation. The community had passed its sentence. Across the town square, the chapel bell, which rang to call the faithful to prayer, to celebrate weddings, and to warn of danger, remained still. Its silence was the most profound sound in Santa Lucia. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut, of a community turning its back, of a woman left utterly and completely alone. The silence that followed Elena back to her small room was heavier than any sound. It was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from the stares and whispers of the townspeople. She felt like a ghost in her own life, visible only as a vessel for their scorn. The air itself seemed to crackle with judgment. She spent the rest of the morning inside, the four walls a poor substitute for a fortress. Her own thoughts her only, and most unforgiving companions. By afternoon, the sky began to change. The endless placid blue gave way to a hazy yellowish pallor at the horizon. The wind, Santa Lucia's constant companion, picked up a new voice. It was no longer a whisper, but a low, mournful howl that rattled the loose pane of glass in her window. It began to carry not just dust, but fine grains of red sand that stung the skin and clouded the air, painting the world in shades of rust and sepia. A sandstorm was brewing, one of the vicious gales that could strip paint from wood and a person of their senses. Elena knew she could not stay in her room forever. Her meager supply of food was gone, and the thought of facing the general store was a misery. But hunger was a more immediate tyrant than shame. Pulling her shawl tight around her head, she stepped out into the alley and leaned into the wind, making her way toward the main street. The town was a blur of swirling red dust. Figures hurried along the boardwalks, heads down, their forms indistinct and ghostly in the maelstrom. The air was thick and tasted of grit. Through the haze, she saw the town's freight wagon, a heavy, lumbering vehicle pulled by a team of 4 stout mules, making its slow way up the street. The driver, a man named Peterson, was a dark shape on the seat, fighting to keep the animals calm as the wind tore at them. He was bringing in supplies, a vital link to the world beyond the desert. Elena kept to the side of the street, her eyes stinging, her focus on putting one foot in front of the other. The roar of the wind was a physical force, pressing in on her, filling her ears. She did not hear the sharp, metallic crack. She did not hear Peterson's shout of alarm, a sound swallowed by the gale. She only became aware of the danger when the deep, rumbling vibration in the ground changed, growing louder, closer, more frantic. She looked up, her shawl whipped across her face by a sudden gust. Through the red curtain of sand, the wagon was no longer a distant shape. It was a monster, untethered and terrifying, careening directly toward her. A linchpin on the front axle had sheared clean through. With the steering gone, the wagon had veered wildly, and the terrified mules, now pulling in different directions, only added to the chaos. The massive, iron-shod wheels were churning the dusty street, gouging deep ruts in the earth. For a heartbeat, Elena was frozen. There was nowhere to run. The boardwalk was too high to leap onto in an instant, and the street was a wide, open killing ground. The world narrowed to the splintered wood of the wagon box and the wild, rolling eyes of the lead mule. Then, another sound cut through the storm. It was the thunder of a single horse moving at a full gallop, a sound of purpose and speed that was different from the wagon's clumsy rampage. Out of the red haze to her left, a rider materialized. It was Jackson Cole. He was leaning low over his horse's neck, his hat pulled down tight, his face a mask of intense concentration. He was not riding away from the danger, but straight into its path. His big buckskin horse, responding to the silent commands of his body, drew level with the careening wagon. Jackson did not hesitate. In a fluid motion of breathtaking strength and timing, he urged his horse directly in front of the panicked mules, using his own mount's powerful body to block and turn the team. The buckskin screamed, a sound of protest and effort as it was slammed by the momentum of the heavier wagon, but it held its ground, muscles quivering. At the same moment the horse made contact. Jackson leaned far out of his saddle, his arm reaching for Elena, his hand clamped around her upper arm like a vice. He did not slow down. With a single, powerful heave, he pulled her from her feet, lifting her clear of the ground just as the massive front wheel of the wagon smashed into the spot where she had been standing, splintering a loose hitching rail into kindling. He hauled her sideways, half carrying, half dragging her out of the wagon's destructive path. They stumbled together into the deep dust of the street as the broken wagon, its momentum finally slowing, ground to a halt a dozen yards away. The air was a choking cloud of sand and chaos. The mules brayed with fear, and Peterson, the driver, was shouting curses at the wind, his wagon, and his luck. Jackson held her for a moment to be sure she was steady on her feet. The wind howled around them, an indifferent witness to the near tragedy. He let go of her arm, his face streaked with red dust, his breathing hard. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rasp, barely audible above the gale. "Are you all right, miss?" Elena was gasping for air, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel the phantom weight of the wheel, the cold certainty of her own death just a second before. She looked at the splintered wood, then back at his grim, concerned face. A bubble of wild, hysterical relief rose in her throat, and with it, a flash of her old, defiant spirit. She pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, leaving a muddy streak across her cheek. "All right," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "If all right means I still have all my teeth." A flicker of something, maybe surprise or the barest hint of a smile, touched the corners of his mouth before disappearing. The storm showed no signs of letting up. "This is no place to be," he said, his voice firm. "You will come with me." It was not a request. He took her arm again, this time more gently, and led her to his horse. The buckskin stood trembling, its sides heaving, but it was unharmed, with an ease that spoke of a lifetime of such things. Jackson swung into the saddle and then reached down for her. Elena hesitated for only a second before taking his hand. He pulled her up behind him, settling her on the horse's rump. "Ride with me," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. "The storm is getting worse." He nudged the horse forward, and they moved away from the chaos of the wrecked wagon, heading out of town. The wind was a solid wall against them, but the big horse moved with a steady, powerful gait. Jackson's body in front of her was a shield against the worst of the stinging sand. Elena wrapped her arms around his waist to keep her balance, pressing her face against the rough fabric of his jacket. She could feel the solid strength of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time since coming to Santa Lucia, she felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of safety. The ride to the Double C Ranch was a blur of red wind and the constant, reassuring motion of the horse beneath them. When they finally rode under the high arch of the ranch gate, the fury of the wind seemed to lessen slightly, blocked by the solid adobe walls of the main house and the long, low shapes of the barns and outbuildings. In the center of the ranch yard, a rusty windmill groaned and squealed as it fought the wind, its blades turning fitfully, pumping a thin, precious stream of water into a large metal tank. Each creak of the mechanism sounded like a painful complaint, yet the water, a mere trickle, kept falling. Jackson dismounted and helped her down. Her legs were shaky and she stumbled. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow. A woman came out of the main house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was taller than Elena, with Jackson's same steady eyes and a face that was plain, but full of sense and compassion. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but a few stray strands had escaped to whip around her face in the wind. "May, this is Miss Alvarez," Jackson said, his voice losing some of its harsh edge. "She had a near accident in town, the storm." His sister, May Cole, looked Elena over with a practiced eye, the gaze of a woman who had seen her share of injuries and troubles. May was the unofficial doctor and midwife for half the territory, a woman whose knowledge of healing herbs and setting bones was more trusted than that of any formally trained physician. "Come inside, child," May said, her voice calm and kind. "Let us get you out of this wind and have a look at you." Inside the ranch house, the roar of the storm was muffled to a distant moan. The air was warm and smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. May sat Elena down in a sturdy wooden chair and began to gently clean the scrapes on her hands and face with a damp cloth. She found a long, shallow gash on Elena's forearm where a piece of flying debris must have hit her. as May expertly cleaned and bandaged the wound. Jackson stood by the stone fireplace, his back to them, staring into the low flames. "You were very lucky," May said, her touch gentle but firm. "Jackson's horse is smart, but luck was on your side today." Elena murmured her thanks, feeling a blush of shame creep up her neck. She was an intruder here, a problem brought in from the storm. The kindness of these people felt sharp in contrast to the cruelty of the town. "As soon as the wind dies down, I will go," she said, her voice quiet. "I do not want to be a burden." Jackson turned from the fireplace. "The storm will not break before morning," he stated simply. "You will stay the night." He looked at his sister. "We need help in the kitchen. Our cook quit last week. Miss Alvarez can stay and help you. May, she can earn her keep." The offer was a lifeline, but Elena's pride stung. She did not want charity. "I cannot," she said, shaking her head. "You do not understand. My being here will bring trouble to your door. The town. They think." She trailed off, unable to voice the accusations. Jackson's gaze was direct, unwavering. "I know what they think," he said, his voice low and even. "Around here, if someone does wrong, I say it. If they do not, I protect them. It is as simple as that." His words hung in the warm air, a simple declaration of a simple, unshakable code. It was more than anyone had offered her. It was everything. Before she could find the words to respond, a frantic barking erupted from the dogs in the yard. Jackson moved to the window, peering out into the swirling red dusk. "3 women on a buckboard have just pulled up to the gate," he announced, his voice flat. Abigail Webb and her friends. A cold knot of dread formed in Elena's stomach. She had brought the trouble with her after all. May put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Do not you worry," she said softly. "My brother knows how to handle Abigail Webb." Jackson pulled on a heavy leather coat. "Stay here," he said to Elena, and then he walked out the door, closing it firmly behind him. He strode across the windy yard to the main gate, where Abigail Webb and 2 other members of her morality society sat huddled in their buckboard, their face pinched with disapproval. Sheriff Harlan had arrived with them, looking deeply uncomfortable, his horse shifting nervously beside the wagon. "So, Jackson Cole," Abigail began, her voice shrill, trying to be heard over the wind. "We know you have that woman in your house, the thief. We will not have it. For the good of Santa Lucia, you must turn her out." Jackson rested his hands on the top rail of the gate, his expression unreadable. "She is under my roof," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "She will stay." Abigail's face tightened. "Perhaps you do not understand the situation," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "My husband at the bank was just reviewing your account, that large loan you took out for winter cattle feed. It would be a terrible shame if the bank were forced to call it in early. A terrible shame indeed." The threat was bald, undisguised. Sheriff Harlan cleared his throat. "Now, Jackson," he began, trying for a placating tone, "for the sake of keeping the peace in town." Jackson's gaze shifted to the sheriff, and it was as cold and hard as desert rock. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke, his words cutting through the wind and the threats with absolute finality. "This ranch road is not owned by the bank." Then he turned his back on them, a gesture of dismissal more profound than any shout, and walked back toward the house. He left them there, sputtering in the dust and the wind, their power utterly useless against the quiet certainty of one man. Back inside, he took off the heavy coat and, without a word, draped it over the back of the chair where Elena sat. It was still warm from his body and smelled of leather and the storm. It felt like a shield. She looked from his impassive face to the groaning windmill outside the window, still fighting the gale, still pumping it slow, steady, life giving drops of water into the tank. Hope, she thought, was sometimes a small and painful thing, but it was there. The sandstorm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world scoured clean. The air was crisp and cool, washed by a brief, hard rain that had followed in the storm's wake, and the sky was a deep, impossible blue. The red dust was gone, settled into a thin film on every surface, and the land looked new again. Inside the Double C Ranch house, the quiet was a welcome balm. The day began with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Elena, feeling shy and out of place, offered to help May in the kitchen. She moved with a nervous uncertainty, a stark contrast to May's efficient, practiced movements. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a large, warm room dominated by a massive iron stove, a long wooden table, its surface worn smooth by years of meals and conversation, stood in the center. When it was time for the midday meal, the ranch hands filed in, their faces weathered and curious. They were quiet men, taking their measure of her with quick, sideways glances. Jackson sat at the head of the table, a silent, commanding presence. Elena helped May serve, her hands trembling slightly as she ladled thick bean stew into bowls. As she reached across the table to serve a young hand named Billy, her nervous grip on the spoon faltered. It clattered from her hand, spattering brown stew onto the clean floorboards. A flush of mortification burned her cheeks. She stammered an apology, bending to retrieve the spoon, but Jackson was already moving. He got up from his chair, picked up the spoon without a word, and took it to the wash basin. He pumped some water and washed it clean, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The room was silent. He dried the spoon on a cloth and handed it back to her, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. "I have dropped a few things myself," he said, his voice a low rumble that was for her alone. "It will not kill anyone." He returned to his seat, and the meal resumed as if nothing had happened. But for Elena, something profound had shifted. In his simple, quiet action, there was no judgment, no condescension. There was only a simple acceptance of a small human failing. It was a kindness more potent than any grand gesture, a small anchor in the turbulent sea of her life. In the days that followed, Elena searched for a way to earn the shelter she had been given. She was a liability to Jackson, a fact that weighed heavily on her. She saw the way the other ranchers who came to do business with him looked at her, their curiosity tinged with the poison of the town's gossip. One afternoon, as she sat mending one of Jackson's shirts, she saw a group of children, the sons and daughters of the ranch hands, playing a wild game of tag in the dusty yard. An idea, a fragile seed of her old dream, began to sprout. She spoke to May about it, her voice hesitant. "I could teach them," she offered, "their letters and numbers." "It is what I wanted to do in town." May's sensible face broke into a warm smile. "That is a fine idea, Elena, a fine idea indeed. They are good children, but wild as mustangs. A bit of learning would do them a world of good." They set up a makeshift schoolhouse in a clean, sweet-smelling corner of the hay barn. A few old planks set on barrels became desks, and May found a small slate and a handful of chalk. 5 children, ranging in age from 6 to 10, appeared for the first lesson, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and suspicion. At first, they were shy, but Elena's gentle patience soon won them over. She had a gift for it, for making the strange shapes of the alphabet seem like a wonderful game. Within a few days, the barn was filled with the sound of their high, piping voices reciting their letters. They adored her. They brought her gifts of wildflowers and pretty rocks and vied for the chance to sit beside her. One warm afternoon, as the children struggled to form their letters on their slates, Elena found herself humming a tune from her past. It was a soft, sad Mexican ballad her husband, Mateo, had loved. She sang the words quietly, almost to herself, a story of a love lost too soon. The children fell silent, listening, their faces rapt. The song brought a familiar ache to her heart, the ghost of her grief. But as she looked at the small, earnest faces turned up to hers. She realized the ache was different now. It was no longer a raw, open wound, but a healed-over scar. A part of her, yes, but not the whole. Her eyes, which had for so long held only the shadow of her loss, were a little less sad. The fragile peace of the ranch was a world away from the simmering resentment in Santa Lucia. But the town could not be kept at bay forever. One afternoon, a young boy named Toby, the 8-year-old son of a ranch hand named Marcus, took a tumble from the top rail of a corral fence. He landed hard, and his cry of pain brought May and Elena running. A long, jagged tear in his trousers revealed a deep gash in his leg, bleeding freely. May took one look and sent another hand riding for Marcus and his wife. "Sarah, bring him inside," she commanded Elena, her voice calm and steady. They laid Toby on the big kitchen table. May's movements were swift and sure as she cleaned the wound. The cut was deep and would need stitching. Elena, her own fear pushed aside by the urgency of the moment, was right beside her, handing her clean cloths, boiling a needle and thread, and speaking to Toby in a low, soothing voice. When Sarah arrived, her face was a pale mask of terror. She saw the needle in May's hand and the blood on the cloth and let out a small cry. But she also saw the way Elena was holding her son's hand, murmuring to him, her presence a small island of calm in the storm of a mother's fear. Together, May and Elena stitched the wound closed, their hands moving in a practiced, complementary rhythm. When it was over, and Toby was resting on a cot with a piece of May's gingerbread in his hand, Sarah turned to Elena. Her eyes were filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude. She took Elena's hands in her own. "I heard what they said in town," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was afraid. I was wrong. Thank you. You saved him." It was not true. Of course, May had done the real work. But Sarah's words, and the genuine warmth in her grip, felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. One family, at least, saw her not as a sinner but as a person. The news of Elena's established presence at the Double C reached Abigail Webb, and it fanned the flames of her righteous indignation. Her public shaming at the ranch gate had not broken Jackson Cole, so she escalated her campaign. She drew up a petition, a long, scrolling document filled with florid language about protecting the virtue of their community and casting out corrupting influences. She took it from house to house, using her social standing and her husband's financial power as leverage. "Sign it," her polite insistence implied, "or you might find your next loan application denied." She went further, threatening a full boycott. Any merchant who sold supplies to the Double C Ranch, any family who accepted work there, would be shunned. She was attempting to build a wall around Jackson Cole, to isolate him and starve him into submission. The town, for the most part, bent to her will, cowed by her power and swayed by her relentless campaign of whispers. Jackson heard the news from Marcus, Toby's father, who had ridden into town for supplies and been met with cold shoulders and thinly veiled threats. Jackson listened, his face impassive, but a hard light glinted in his eyes. He made his decision quickly. The next morning, he informed May that he was going to the monthly market fair in town, and he was taking Miss Alvarez and the children with him. It was a public declaration of war, fought not with guns, but with simple, undeniable presence. Elena was terrified. To go back into town, to face those people, seemed an impossible ordeal. But when she looked at Jackson, at the quiet determination in his face, and then at the excited faces of the children who so rarely got to leave the ranch, she could not refuse. They rode into Santa Lucia in the big ranch wagon, Jackson handling the reins, Elena sitting beside him on the bench seat, the children laughing and jostling in the back. As they moved down the main street, a hush fell over the market. Conversations stopped, heads turned. The air grew thick with unspoken hostility. Elena felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, and she had to clench her hands in her lap to stop them from trembling. Jackson seemed oblivious, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw set. He pulled the wagon to a stop and helped her down. Then he turned to the vendors. His first stop was at the stall of a poor widow named Mrs. Gable, a woman known for her excellent honey cakes. A few moments before, a group of women led by Abigail's closest friend had been loudly informing Mrs. Gable that they would not be buying from her today, or any day, if she continued to do business with the Double C. The old woman's face was pale and distressed, her livelihood threatened. Jackson walked directly to her stall. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice calm and clear. "For all to hear, your cakes look fine today. I will take all of them." He paid her in silver, far more than the cakes were worth, and handed the large basket to the children. The message was unmistakable. He would not only defy the boycott, he would support those who were being punished for not joining it. It was an act of quiet, practical justice that resonated more powerfully than any angry speech. They moved through the market, Jackson making a point to buy something from every vendor, the children trailing behind him like a small, happy army. The townspeople watched, their expressions ranging from sullen anger to grudging respect. At the saddlemaker's stall, while Jackson was inspecting a new cinch, Elena found herself drawn to a display of hats. On an impulse, to distract herself from the constant scrutiny, she picked up a wide-brimmed straw hat. It was far too large for her, and when she put it on, it slipped down over her eyes, plunging her into comical darkness. She heard a low chuckle behind her. She pushed the hat back up to find Jackson standing there, the corner of his mouth twitching in that rare hint of a smile. He looked her over, his gaze lingering for a moment. "Wear that," he said, his voice laced with a dry humor she had never heard before, "and the wind will not be able to blow any stray thoughts into your head." Elena felt a surprising warmth spread through her chest, in that small, shared moment of levity. In the middle of a hostile town, she felt a connection to him that was new and startlingly real. The heavy weight of her fear seemed to lift, just for a moment. Later that afternoon, back at the ranch, the rain began to fall again, a soft, steady shower that washed the dust from the air. Elena stood on the porch, watching it. The water from the overflowing stock tank, fed by the tireless windmill, had carved a small, dark channel in the earth, a miniature river flowing toward the parched garden. In the distance, she could see the arroyo. It was no longer a dry, dead thing. A thin silver ribbon of water glittered in its bed, reflecting the gray sky. It was not a flood, not a torrent, but it was life. It was a sign that even in the driest of places, trust and hope could, with a little help, begin to flow again. The defiance at the market had cost them. While Jackson's wealth insulated the Double C from the worst of Abigail Webb's boycott, the air was thick with a new tension. Fewer riders came to call, and those who did had a furtive, hurried manner about them. The isolation, once a source of strength for the ranch, now felt like the walls of a siege closing in. Yet, within those walls, something new and fragile was taking root. The shared meal after the trip to town was different. The ranch hands looked at Elena with a newfound respect, and the children chattered excitedly about their adventure. She was no longer just a refugee Jackson had taken in. She was one of them. One evening, a few days later, a chill wind swept down from the Sangre de Cristos, carrying the first real hint of autumn. A fire crackled in the hearth of the main house, casting long, dancing shadows on the adobe walls. The children were asleep, and May was in her room, preparing some herbal remedies. Jackson and Elena sat in the quiet, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. He was oiling a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly deft, and she was mending a small tear in Toby's shirt. The warmth of the fire seemed to loosen something inside her, a knot of fear and shame she had carried for so long. She looked at the man across from her, his face cast in the warm glow of the firelight, and felt an overwhelming urge to offer him the truth. The whole of it. It felt like a debt she owed him for his trust. "My husband, Matteo, he was a miner," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands stilled in her lap. "We were young. He found work in El Paso. But it was not enough. I have a voice. I can sing. So I found a job at a place called the Santa Rosa Cantina." Jackson stopped his work, his hands resting on the leather. He did not look at her, but his attention was absolute. A quiet invitation to continue. "It was not a dance hall. Not like they say," she clarified. The words tumbling out now. "Men drank, and I sang ballads on a small stage. It paid for our room, for better food, for a while. It was good. But the owner, he was not a good man. He began to pressure me. He said a singer should be more friendly to the customers who spent the most money. He wanted me to sit with them, to let them buy me drinks, and more." She took a shaky breath, the memory still sharp and ugly. "One night, he cornered me in the hallway after I finished singing. He had been drinking. He grabbed my arm and told me I was done just singing. I told him I was a married woman. He just laughed. He said that did not matter to him. So I slapped him. Hard. And I walked out that door and never went back. Matteo and I left El Paso the next day. But the story, it followed us. The owner, to save his pride, he told everyone I'd been his special girl, that I had run off. The lie was easier for people to believe than the truth." She fell silent, her story told, her heart pounding with the vulnerability of it all. She waited for his judgment, for the flicker of disgust or disappointment in his eyes. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with an old, buried pain. "My wife's name was Elizabeth," he said, his eyes still on the fire. "We were married in '80. She came here from back east. This land was hard on her. The heat, the dust. In the summer of '82, a fever came through the territory. Malaria. It took her in less than a week." He paused, the silence in the room filled with the weight of his loss. "I was with her. I held her hand. The preacher came, said it was God's will. I have not been inside a church since. It felt like an empty room full of empty words. After that, I just worked, bought more land, more cattle. Work fills the empty spaces. Or you think it does. It just builds walls around them." He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw not judgment, but a deep, shared understanding of loss. They were two people marked by the past, two people who knew the hollowness that grief leaves behind. In that moment, the connection she had felt at the market deepened into something more profound, a quiet recognition of a kindred soul. The next week, news arrived that Mr. Webb's bank was calling in the loans on several of the smaller ranches in the area. It was a transparently punitive move, a way for Abigail to punish anyone who had not fallen in line with her boycott. The ranchers affected were good people, hard-working families who would be ruined. Jackson heard the news from Marcus, whose own small spread was among those threatened. That afternoon, Jackson rode into town. He did not seek confrontation. He walked into the bank, spoke quietly with Mr. Webb for 10 minutes, and walked out. Later, Marcus and 2 other ranchers rode out to the Double C, their faces a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. Jackson had used his own considerable assets to personally guarantee their loans, shielding them from the bank's demands. He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for Elena, but for the principle of a fair fight. Abigail Webb's war had just become much more expensive for her. It was during that visit that Elena saw the clue. The 3 grateful ranchers had brought their families to thank Jackson, and among them was Abigail's son, Conrad Webb. Conrad was a young man who tried to imitate his father's importance, but lacked the substance, his face a constant mask of bored arrogance. He had come along, it seemed, mostly to sneer at the proceedings, As he dismounted from his horse near the main house, Elena, who was bringing out a pitcher of lemonade, happened to glance down. The boots he wore were expensive, tooled leather, but they were caked with mud around the soles, and the mud was a deep, distinctive red, the color of the clay-rich soil down by the arroyo, right behind the town granary. She had noticed that same red mud on her own shoes the day she had first walked the town's perimeter, looking for a place to live. It was a small detail, one that meant nothing on its own, but the image lodged itself in her mind. Conrad Webb, a man who rarely did a day of hard labor, with the very specific mud of the crime scene clinging to his boots, a seed of suspicion, dark and uncertain, was planted. Later, as she and May were washing the glasses, Elena felt a sudden lightness, a release from some of the tension. It was the effect of Jackson's quiet strength, the feeling that they were not just passively enduring an attack but actively fighting back. "Your brother is a good man," Elena said, drying a glass until it shone, "but he is as talkative as a cactus." May looked at her, a knowing smile touching her eyes. "A cactus can be prickly." "It is true," she replied, her voice gentle, "but even a cactus blooms. My dear, you just have to be patient enough to see it." The words stayed with Elena, a small, hopeful promise. That evening, a thought that had been troubling her came to the surface. Her small room behind the general store, which she had paid for through the end of the month, still held the few meager possessions she had brought to Santa Lucia: a spare dress, a small wooden box of Mateo's things, a worn blanket. They were ghosts of a life that was over, and the room itself was a symbol of her rejection by the town. She told Jackson she needed to go and collect her things. He simply nodded and said he would take her. They went after dusk. In the ranch wagon, the town was quiet. The windows of her old room were dark and looked out on the alley like vacant eyes, working together in the faint glow of a lantern. They quickly packed her belonging. As she picked up the blanket, the smell of the dusty, lonely room filled her senses, and she shivered. Back at the ranch, Jackson did not drive to the main house. He steered the wagon to an open, fallow field a good distance from the barns. He got down and began to unload her things, piling them in the center of the field. "What are you doing?" she asked, confused. He looked at her, his face serious in the moonlight. "When the old things burn away," he said softly, "it makes room for new things to grow." Understanding dawned on her. It was a ceremony, a cleansing. He struck a match, and the small pile of her past life caught fire. They stood side by side in the cool night air, watching the flames leap and dance, consuming the thin dress, the worn blanket, the very memory of her loneliness. The fire was a living thing, beautiful and fierce, and in its heat, she felt a profound sense of release. The smoke carried away the scent of dust and fear, leaving only the clean smell of the desert night. The past was turning to ash. It was over. As the fire died down to a glowing bed of embers, she felt a new resolve solidify within her. Jackson had given her sanctuary, protection, and respect, but she could not live on his charity forever. To do so would be to accept the role of a dependent, the very thing her enemies accused her of being. She needed to stand on her own feet, to build something that was hers. The children, she thought, the school. It was more than just a way to pass the time. It was a purpose. The next day, she found Jackson down by the old sheepfold. It was a long, low structure, unused for years, but the roof was sound and the walls were solid. The small flock of sheep that the ranch kept for wool and mutton grazed peacefully nearby, their presence a symbol of the fragile, gentle life she wanted to build. "I want to start a proper school," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not just for the ranch children, but for any who will come. I want to charge a small fee, enough to pay for my keep. For books and slates. I want to do it here, in this building." Jackson looked from the old sheepfold to her determined face. He saw not a victim asking for another handout, but a woman forging her own future. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "It is a good building," he said. "It will need some work. We can start tomorrow." The work on the old sheepfold transformed the structure and the people who worked on it. Jackson, along with Marcus and a few other loyal hands, spent the better part of a week reinforcing the roof, replacing rotten boards, and building sturdy benches and a long teacher's desk from fresh pine. The scent of sawdust and honest labor filled the air, a clean, hopeful smell that pushed back against the lingering stain of the town's gossip. Elena worked alongside them, her hands growing calloused as she swept out decades of dust, washed the grime from the few glass window panes, and whitewashed the interior walls until the small building was bright and welcoming. The children watched the transformation with wide, excited eyes. It was their school, a place being built just for them, and their enthusiasm was a potent antidote to the hostility that still simmered in Santa Lucia. Even a few families from the smaller, neighboring ranches, emboldened by Jackson's stand at the bank, had quietly sent word that they would be sending their children to be taught. Elena's small dream was taking on the solid, tangible shape of a real future. The day they finished, they all stood back to admire their work. The sheepfold was no longer a forgotten relic. It was a beacon. Inside, the children's first clumsy attempts at writing their names were tacked to the wall, each one a small flag of victory. Elena felt a surge of pride and gratitude so powerful it almost brought her to tears. That night, the ranch settled into a peaceful quiet. A sliver of moon hung in the inky black sky, and the stars were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds. The wind, for once, was still. A deep, profound peace seemed to have settled over the double sea. It was the kind of peace that comes just before the storm. The first sign of trouble was the frantic, panicked bleating of the sheep. It was a sound of pure terror that sliced through the night's tranquility. It was followed almost immediately by the savage barking of the ranch dogs. Lights appeared in the windows of the bunkhouse and the main house. Jackson was the first one out, pulling on his boots, a rifle in his hand, his mind on coyotes or a mountain lion. But as he stepped onto the porch, he saw it. It was not a predator of the four-legged kind. Against the blackness of the night, a terrible, hungry orange light was pulsing, growing, eating the darkness. The new schoolhouse was on fire. Flames were already licking up the dry, seasoned wood of the walls, greedily consuming the hard work and hope that had been poured into the building. The fire was unnaturally fast, unnervingly deliberate. Someone had done this. Elena was just behind him, her face a pale mask of horror in the flickering light. "Oh, no," she whispered, the words a breathless prayer. "The children's notebooks, their work, it is all in there." Before Jackson could stop her, she was gone, running toward the burning building. She was not thinking of the danger, only of the small, precious symbols of her students' progress, the tangible proof that her new life was real. Jackson shouted her name, his voice raw with alarm, and started after her. The ranch hands were spilling out of the bunkhouse now, their faces grim in the firelight. Elena reached the schoolhouse door and plunged inside without a second's hesitation. The heat was a physical blow, and the air was a thick and choking blanket of smoke that immediately blinded her and stole her breath. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling beneath the worst of the smoke, her eyes streaming. She could hear the terrible roar of the fire, the crackle and groan of the roof timbers. The desk. She had to get to the desk. She had placed the stack of notebooks there just before leaving for the evening. Outside, the night wind, which had been so deceptively calm, began to stir. It was a low, mournful sigh at first, then a rising moan. It swirled around the burning building, finding the new gaps in the walls where the flames had eaten through and fanned them into a raging inferno. The fire, fed by the wind, exploded with a hungry roar. Jackson reached the doorway just as a flaming beam crashed down from the ceiling, blocking the entrance. "Elena!" He roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He could not see her. The inside was a swirling vortex of orange flame and black smoke. His men were there, their faces stark with shock. "Bucket line," he yelled, his mind snapping into the sharp focus of command. "Marcus, get the axes. We have to get her out." They worked with a desperate, frantic energy. A line of men formed between the water tank and the fire, passing buckets of precious water that seemed to sizzle into steam the moment they hit the flames. Marcus and another hand, their faces covered with wet kerchiefs, began hacking at the wall of the building, trying to create another opening. The heat was immense, driving them back, searing their skin. The air filled with the sharp crack of splitting wood and the hiss of evaporating water. Jackson grabbed a heavy horse blanket from a nearby fence, plunged it into the water trough until it was soaked and heavy, and wrapped it around his head and shoulders. He took a deep breath of the cleaner air near the ground and charged through the wall of flame where the door had been. Inside was a vision of hell. The smoke was so thick he could barely see, his lungs burning with every breath. He shouted her name again, his voice a raw, ragged thing. He saw a small, dark shape huddled on the floor near the far wall, by the wreckage of the teacher's desk. It was Elena. She was conscious but disoriented, coughing violently. The stack of notebooks clutched to her chest. He reached her in 3 long strides, his boots crunching on hot embers. "Come on," he said, his voice urgent, pulling her to her feet. She was weak, stumbling, her body trembling. There was no time to reason with her. He scooped her up into his arms, her head falling against his shoulder. He turned back toward the inferno that blocked their exit. The main roof beam groaned, a terrible, final sound, and then gave way. The center of the roof collapsed inward in a shower of sparks and flaming debris, sending a wave of superheated air blasting toward them. Jackson shielded Elena with his body, the heavy, wet blanket his only protection. The heat was a living thing, clawing at him, blistering his exposed hands as he held her. He did not hesitate. He lowered his head and ran, a blind, desperate charge through the heart of the fire. For a few terrible seconds, the world was nothing but roaring, blinding heat and the crushing weight of the woman in his arms. He felt the fire singe his hair, his clothes. He could feel the skin on his hands blistering, but he did not loosen his grip. His only thought was to get through, to get to the clean, cool air of the night. He burst out of the burning building and stumbled into the yard, his lungs screaming for air. He did not stop until he was a safe distance away, where he gently laid Elena on the ground. She was coughing, gasping, but she was alive. The notebooks were still clutched in her arms, singed at the edges but intact. May was there, her face a study in controlled calm, with water and clean cloths. The hands had managed to keep the fire from spreading to the other buildings, but the schoolhouse was a total loss, a blackened, skeletal ruin against the night sky. As May tended to Elena, Jackson stood up, his body shaking with adrenaline. He looked at his hands. They were a mess of angry red burns and broken blisters, the pain a dull, throbbing roar. He barely noticed it. His eyes scanned the ground around the ruined building, lit by the dying glow of the fire. His gaze, trained to notice every detail of the land, caught something. There, half buried in the dirt and scuffed by a boot heel, was a small, metallic object, glinting in the firelight. He bent down and picked it up. It was a silver lighter, elegant and expensive. It was heavy in his palm, and on its smooth, polished surface, engraved in a scrolling script, were the initials C.W. He stared at it, the truth clicking into place with cold, hard certainty. He looked up and met his sister's eyes across the yard. She had seen him pick it up. He held it out on his open palm for her to see. May's face went still, her expression hardening as she recognized the object. She said nothing, but her silence was a confirmation, a shared and terrible knowledge. The next morning, the news of the fire had spread through the territory. The reaction was as divided as the town itself. Some, like the families whose children Elena had taught, were horrified. They rode out to the ranch to offer their help and their sympathy. But another, uglier story was already taking root in Santa Lucia, a story planted and carefully watered by Abigail Webb and her allies. They whispered it over fences and in the general store. It was all a little too convenient. They said, a little too dramatic. What a perfect way for Jackson Cole to make himself look like a hero, and for that woman to make herself a martyr. They probably set the fire themselves, just for the attention. The lie was a poison, turning sympathy into suspicion. Elena woke up in a guest room in the main house, her throat raw, her body aching. The first thing she saw was Jackson, sitting in a chair by her bed. His hands were wrapped in clean white bandages. She looked at his hands, then at his tired, smoke-stained face. A wave of guilt washed over her. All of this, all of his pain, was because of her. A weak attempt at her usual wit was the only defense she could muster against the tears that threatened to fall. "You should not have tried to catch the fire from someone else's jealousy for me," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. For the first time since she had met him, a genuine, undeniable smile touched Jackson Cole's lips. It was a small thing, a brief crack in his stoic facade, but it lit up his entire face. The smile faded, and the weariness returned to his eyes. Elena pushed herself up on her elbows. "I have to leave. Jackson," she said, the words costing her everything. "I cannot let you do this. I cannot be the cause of any more trouble for you. I will not be the reason you lose everything." He looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. He reached out with his bandaged hand and laid it gently on her arm. The touch was surprisingly soft, despite the layers of cloth. "If you leave," he said, his voice quiet but filled with an unshakable conviction, "they win." Jackson Cole's words, a simple promise of solidarity, were a stronger balm than any of May's salves. They extinguished the impulse for flight within Elena, replacing it with a fragile, fierce resolve. They would not win. She would not let them. The fire had destroyed a building, but it had forged something new in its place. A partnership, unspoken but solid as the bedrock beneath the ranch. The town, however, was a tinderbox of rumor and suspicion. The story of the fire, twisted by Abigail Webb's relentless narrative, had solidified the battle lines. You were either with the Webbs and the preservation of decency, or you were with the outsider and the rancher who harbored her. There was no middle ground left. The pressure mounted until it was clear the situation could not hold. It was Father O'Rourke, the town's quiet, weary priest, who finally insisted on a town meeting. "Let everything be brought into the light," he urged, his voice tired of the whispers in the dark. The meeting was to be held in the chapel, the one place in Santa Lucia that was supposed to be a sanctuary for all. The air inside the small wooden church was thick and heavy, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with piety. The entire town seemed to be packed onto the hard wooden pews, men on one side, women on the other, their Sunday clothes doing little to soften their grim, expectant faces. It was not a congregation. It was a jury. Elena sat beside Jackson and May in the front pew, feeling the weight of 100 hostile stares on her back. She kept her eyes fixed on the simple wooden cross at the altar, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Abigail Webb stood near the pulpit, dressed in a severe black dress that made her look like a hanging judge. She began to speak, her voice ringing with a practiced, theatrical righteousness. She spoke of the town's good character, of its peace and purity, a peace that had been shattered by the arrival of an element of questionable repute. She did not use Elena's name, but every eye in the room turned to her. Abigail recounted the story of the stolen money, painting Elena's return of the pouch as a cunning trick. She spoke of the fire, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, suggesting the terrible convenience of it all, how it cast certain people in a heroic light while preying on the town's sympathies. She was a master of insinuation. weaving a tapestry of suspicion without a single provable fact. When she finished, the silence was a coiled snake. Abigail looked expectantly at Sheriff Harlan, who stood awkwardly near the door, looking as if he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Helena felt a fire of a different kind ignite within her. She could not sit in silence and let these lies become her truth. She stood up, her movement drawing a collective gasp from the crowd. "May I speak?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. All eyes shifted from Abigail to her before anyone could object. Father O'Rourke, who stood by the altar, gave a slow, deliberate nod. "This is a house of God," he said. "All who wish to speak the truth are welcome to do so." Elena walked to the front of the chapel, standing not at the pulpit but on the floor before the pews, on the same level as everyone else. She looked out at their faces, at the hard-set jaws and the cold, judging eyes. "My name is Elena Alvarez," she began, her voice gaining strength. "You have heard stories about me. I want to tell you the truth. It is true that I sang in a cantina in El Paso. It was called the Santa Rosa. My husband was a miner, and his wages were not enough to live on. I sang songs, that is all. The owner of that place. He wanted more from me. He was a powerful man, and he thought he could buy anything, and anyone. One night, he told me that I would have to start entertaining his wealthy customers in private. I told him I was a married woman and would do no such thing. He did not care. He grabbed me, and so I slapped him across the face, and I left. The next day, my husband and I were gone from El Paso. The owner, a man with a bruised face and a bruised ego, told a different story. It was a story that was easier for men like him to tell, and easier for other people to believe. She paused, letting her words sink in. She did not plead for their sympathy. She simply laid out the facts. Her dignity, her only shield. That is the past for which you have judged me. That is the whole of my crime. A murmur went through the crowd. Some faces softened with a flicker of doubt. Others hardened, unwilling to have their certainty challenged. Before Abigail could launch a counterattack, Jackson Cole stood up. He walked to the front and stood beside Elena. He did not look at the crowd. He looked directly at Conrad Webb, who was sitting beside his mother, a smirk on his face, in his bandaged hand. Jackson held the silver lighter, holding it up so that it caught a beam of sunlight slanting through a high window. "This was found in the dirt outside the schoolhouse after the fire," Jackson said, his voice flat and dangerous. "It has the initials C.W. engraved on it. Conrad, why do you not tell us all where you were on the night of the fire?" Conrad's smirk vanished, his face going pale. He stammered, his eyes darting to his mother. I was at home. I was in bed." "That is enough," Abigail snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. "My son will not be questioned by you. This is a distraction." Sheriff Harlan cleared his throat, taking a step forward. "Now, Jackson," he said, his voice weak. "We have no proof of anything. This is not a formal proceeding. Let us all just remain calm." His fear of the Webb family and their bank was a palpable thing, a yellow streak down the center of his authority. The system, designed to protect the innocent, was bending to protect the powerful. The room was about to erupt, the tension pulling everyone to their feet. But then a new voice cut through the air, calm and full of a quiet, unshakable authority. Piety is not a stone to be thrown at sinners, real or imagined. It was Father O'Rourke. He had stepped forward, his weary eyes moving over the crowd, finally resting on Abigail Webb. This house is a place for confession and forgiveness, not for condemnation and pride. I have listened to the whispers in this town for months. They have been a sickness. I believe we have been judging the wrong person. He turned to the young boy who served as the altar assistant. "Son," he said gently, "ring the bell." For the first time in months, since the day Elena had been accused of theft, the chapel bell began to ring. Its clear, resonant peal broke the ugly tension. A sound of returning sanity, of conscience reawakened. The sound seemed to drive some people to a greater fury. A group of young men, friends of Conrad's, started shouting, their voices rising in anger. They moved toward Jackson, their fists clenched. The meeting was dissolving into a mob. Just as the first shove was given, the chapel doors burst open. A man stood there, breathless, his face white with panic. He was a rancher from up the valley. "The arroyo," he gasped. "The rain in the mountains last night. It is a flash flood. The water is rising fast." A wave of fear, real and immediate, washed through the chapel, extinguishing the petty anger. The arroyo, the town's seasonal lifeline, had become a monster. "My children!" a woman screamed. "They were playing down by the old cottonwoods." That was near the bridge, on the far side of the arroyo from the town. The crowd surged out of the chapel and ran toward the sound of the water. A low, terrifying roar that was growing louder by the second. The scene at the arroyo was one of primal chaos. What had been a dry creek bed an hour ago was now a raging, muddy torrent, a brown beast tearing at its banks, carrying whole trees and debris in its churning current, and on the far side, huddled on a small patch of high ground that was rapidly shrinking, were 3 small children. One of them was Toby. They were trapped, their face small white circles of terror. The crowd milled on the bank, helpless. The bridge was already gone, its timbers smashed and carried away by the flood. No horse could cross that current, no man could swim it. Panic and despair began to set in. It was Elena who moved first. Her mind, sharpened by a life of surviving crises, saw not the chaos but the pieces of a solution. "Rope," she shouted, her voice cutting through the panicked din. "Get every rope you can find." While the men ran to fetch lariats from their saddles, she scanned the debris. There, half submerged near the bank, was a long, heavy log, a timber from the destroyed bridge, that she yelled, pointing, "We need that log." The men, desperate for direction, obeyed without question. They waded into the shallows and managed to heave the heavy, waterlogged timber onto the bank. Jackson was already there, coils of rope over his shoulder. He looked at Elena, a question in his eyes. She met his gaze, her mind working with a swift, clear logic. "We cannot throw a rope that far," she said, her voice fast but steady. "We need to get one end across. We tie the ropes together, tie them to the log. We can push it out into the current, let the water carry it downstream and swing it toward the other bank." It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. They worked together, a small, focused team in the midst of the chaos. The men knotted the ropes together, creating one long line. Elena, her hands sure and steady, tied one end to the center of the heavy log with a knot that would not slip. "Now," Jackson said, his eyes on the raging water. He handed the free end of the long rope to Marcus and 2 other strong men. "You have to hold this, do not let go, no matter what." He himself waded into the churning water, his bandaged hands grabbing the log. He was the anchor, the pivot point. "Push," he yelled. And together, he and several other men shoved the heavy log out into the torrent. The current caught it immediately, snatching it and pulling it downstream with incredible force. The rope went taut, groaning with the strain, a living thing fighting against the river. On the bank, Marcus and the other men dug in their heels, their muscles straining, holding the line against the immense power of the flood. The log swung out in a wide arc. A pendulum in the brown water, it swept downstream, closer and closer to the far bank, toward the small patch of ground where the children were huddled. It slammed into the muddy bank a dozen yards below them. It was enough. The makeshift bridge was in place. Now the hard part, one by one, coaxed by the shouts of their parents. The terrified children made their way along the slippery, bucking log, clinging to the rope for balance. It was a terrifying journey. Twice, Toby slipped, his small body dangling over the raging water, but the grip of the older boy with him held firm. Finally, all 3 were across, sobbing and shivering, swept up into the arms of their hysterical parents. The town, which had been a mob ready to tear itself apart moments before, was now united in a flood of relief and gratitude. Elena and Jackson stood on the bank, soaked, muddy, and exhausted. The water, the very element of nature's blind judgment, had intervened. It had not come to punish, but to reveal. In the face of a real crisis, the town had seen who possessed the courage and clarity to save them. It was not the woman who spoke of morality from a pulpit, but the woman who tied knots in the mud, and the man who stood against the flood to hold the rope. The roar of the floodwaters began to subside, leaving a landscape of raw, wet earth and a stunned, shivering silence. The immediate crisis was over. The children, wrapped in blankets and held tightly in their parents' arms, were safe. The people of Santa Lucia stood on the muddy bank of the arroyo, not as a factioned mob, but as a single, exhausted community that had stared into the face of a shared disaster and survived. Their anger and suspicion had been washed away by the flood, leaving behind the stark, humbling reality of their own vulnerability and the undeniable truth of what they had just witnessed. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible current, the crowd drifted away from the ravaged creek bed and back toward the center of town. They walked in small, quiet groups, their boots heavy with mud, their fine Sunday clothes soaked and ruined. They congregated on the open ground before the chapel, the place where their judgment had almost torn them apart. The late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long, dramatic shadows and steaming the dampness from the ground. Elena stood on the chapel's bottom step, leaning against a post for support, her body drained of all strength. She was covered in mud from her hair to her hem, her face streaked with dirt where she had wiped away sweat and tears. She was exhausted, but she stood straight, her gaze clear. In the golden light of the setting sun, the grime on her face could not hide the quiet, luminous strength that shone from within. Sarah, Toby's mother, was the first to approach her. She said nothing, her throat too thick with emotion. She simply took Elena's muddy hand and squeezed it, her eyes overflowing with a gratitude that no words could express. Marcus stood behind his wife, his hat in his hands, and gave Elena a deep, respectful nod that was more eloquent than any speech. One by one, others followed. The ranch hands from the Double C, of course, but also townspeople. Men who had stood ready to condemn her now looked at the ground in shame. Women who had whispered behind their hands now met her eyes with a dawning respect. They did not apologize. Not yet. The words were too difficult, but their silence was a confession of their error. Abigail Webb and her son, Conrad, stood apart, isolated on the far edge of the crowd. The power she had wielded for so long had vanished, evaporated in the face of real courage. Her face was a frozen mask of disbelief and impotent fury. Then, Jackson Cole moved. He stepped away from the small group of men he had been speaking with and walked to the front of the crowd, mounting the chapel steps to stand beside Elena. He was as muddy and exhausted as she was, the bandages on his hands stained with river water and grime. He turned, not to her, but to face the people of his town. He waited, his silence commanding their full attention, drawing every eye to him. For a long time, he just looked at them, his gaze moving from face to face, his expression grim and unyielding. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried with a weight and clarity that cut through the weary quiet. "You have all had your say about this woman," he began, his voice low and steady. "You have whispered in corners and shouted in God's own house. You have called her a thief and a sinner. You have shunned her for a past that you imagined, for a story you invented to make yourselves feel righteous." He paused, letting the truth of his accusation settle over them. He was not angry. His voice was cold with a profound, unshakable certainty. He looked from the crowd to Elena, and his expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing for the first time. The whole town watched as the quiet, solitary rancher's face was transformed by an emotion he had kept locked away for years. "You saw a sinner to be cast out," he said, his voice now a deep, resonant declaration. But I will tell you what this rich cowboy saw. He saw only her heart, and he is going to make her his wife. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The sheer, audacious simplicity of it stunned them into silence. Jackson's gaze swept back over their faces. His point made, his position absolute. "I do not see a past to judge," he said, his words a final, ringing verdict. "I see a heart to protect." Then he turned his back on the town, on their judgment and their approval alike. He faced Elena, and in that moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to the few feet of muddy ground on the chapel steps that separated them. The crowd, the flood, the fire, all of it faded away, with a grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. Jackson Cole went down on one knee in the wet mud, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out not a velvet box, but a simple, unadorned ring. It was not gold or silver, but a dark, heavy iron, forged into a circle, the faint marks of a hammer still visible on its surface. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "My wife Elizabeth loved her horse more than anything. This was made from a nail from her horse's stall. It is not pretty, it is not fancy, but it is strong. It is made to hold fast, to endure. It stands for loyalty." He held it out to her, his bandaged hand trembling slightly. "Will you marry me?" Tears she did not know she had left to cry welled in Elena's eyes, blurring his image, the ring, the entire world. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so vast and unexpected it was a physical ache in her chest. For a moment, she could not breathe, could not think. She could only feel the solid ground beneath her feet and the steadfast gaze of the man kneeling before her, offering her not just a ring, but a home, a name, and a future free from the shadows of her past. A watery, broken smile touched her lips. A shaky laugh, half a sob, escaped her. She looked down at him, at this impossible, wonderful man kneeling in the mud, and her own resilient spirit, the part of her that had refused to be broken, rose to the surface. "If I am to be your wife," she said, her voice a scratchy whisper, "do I have to learn how to ride a bull before or after the wedding?" His answering smile was slow and wide, a sunrise breaking over his rugged features. He took her hand, his bandaged fingers warm and gentle around hers, and slid the heavy iron ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The spell was broken. A sound erupted from the crowd. It started with Marcus, who let out a whoop of pure joy, and Sarah, who began clapping, her face streaked with tears. Then others joined in, the applause spreading through the assembled townspeople like a wave, a ragged, heartfelt, thunderous sound of approval and release. They were not just clapping for a proposal. They were clapping for the end of a long, ugly sickness, for the simple, cleansing power of a decent act. Sheriff Harlan, seeing the tide of public opinion turn so decisively, began to clap along, a wide, relieved smile on his face, a man overjoyed to finally be on the winning side. Only Abigail Webb and her son stood motionless, their faces pale with shock and utter defeat. The town's applause was the sound of her reign ending, the final, public rejection of her authority. But as the celebration swirled around her, a dark, venomous look entered her eyes. She was not a woman who accepted defeat. She backed away slowly, melting into the shadows at the edge of the crowd. There, she found who she was looking for: two rough-looking men, drifters who sometimes worked odd jobs and were known for their willingness to do anything for a price. They had been watching the proceedings with a detached, vulture-like interest. Abigail drew them deeper into the shadows of the alley beside the chapel. Her back was to the crowd, her movements quick and furtive. The men listened, their expressions greedy. A quiet word, a nod. The glint of coins passing from her hand to theirs. A dark bargain was struck in the shadows. A final, desperate seed of vengeance planted, even as the town celebrated in the light. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with a quiet, industrious joy that felt foreign and wonderful to Elena. The Double C Ranch, which had been her sanctuary, was now transforming into her home. May, with her characteristic lack of fuss, was helping her alter a simple cotton dress, its cream color a stark contrast to the plain, durable fabrics she had worn for years. The ranch hands, who had once viewed her with suspicion, now treated her with a gruff, protective affection. Mending the porch steps of the small foreman's cabin that she and Jackson would share, and arguing amongst themselves over who had the best recipe for wedding barbecue. Peace was a fragile thing in this territory, however, and while the ranch buzzed with happy preparation, a shadow lingered. Abigail Webb had been publicly humiliated, her power broken on the steps of the chapel. A woman like that, as May had quietly observed, did not simply accept defeat. She let it fester, let it curdle into something far more poisonous. A traveling journalist had arrived in Santa Lucia, a man named Hank, drawn by the stories of the fire and the flood. He was a lanky, cynical man with a perpetually skeptical squint and a heavy box camera he treated with more care than he did most people. He claimed to be interested only in the unvarnished truth, which made him an object of immediate suspicion to most of the town. Intrigued by the unfolding drama, he had ridden out to the Double C and, finding Jackson Cole surprisingly willing to let him observe, had decided to stay, sensing the story was not yet over. The night before the wedding was clear and cold. A brilliant canopy of stars glittered in the sky, seeming close enough to touch. A final supply wagon was due to arrive from a town further south, carrying barrels of flour, sugar, and other necessities for the wedding feast. It was Marcus's wagon, the man whose son Toby had been rescued from the flood. He had insisted on making the trip as a personal thank you. He was late. As the hours ticked by, a thread of unease wove itself through the festive atmosphere. Jackson stood on the porch, staring out into the darkness, his calm exterior a thin veil over a watchful tension. It was close to midnight when they heard it. Not the familiar rumble of the wagon, but a single, desperate shout, followed by the splintering crack of wood and the panicked braying of mules. The sounds were distant but carried clearly on the cold night air. Jackson was moving before the last echo had faded, grabbing a lantern and his rifle. Marcus and two other hands, their faces grim, joined him, saddling their horses with a swift, practiced urgency. "Wait," Elena said, a sudden, piercing thought cutting through her fear. She had run out onto the porch, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. She had heard something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sound just before the shout. It was a high-pitched musical whistle. "It is Marcus's wagon," she said, her voice quick and certain. "The brakes. When he uses them on the downhill grade, the left one whistles like a bird. I have heard it a dozen times when he comes to the ranch." Jackson stopped, turning to her. His eyes narrowed in the lantern light. "What are you saying?" "That sound," she insisted, "it is a town joke. Anyone who has been here a year knows it. If someone were planning to stage a robbery, to make it look like outsiders, the very first thing they would do is fix that brake so it did not announce their arrival a mile away. Only someone local, someone arrogant enough not to think of it, would make that mistake." Her eyes met his, and in the space of a heartbeat, they shared the same chilling certainty. This was not a random act of violence. It was a message, and it was clumsy. It was the work of Conrad Webb. May had come out, her face pale. Hank, the journalist, emerged from the bunkhouse where he had been quartered, his camera case in his hand. "Smells like a story," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "We ride," Jackson said, his voice like iron. "May, you are with me. Hank, you can come, but you stay out of the way." They rode hard into the darkness, not toward the site of the crash, but on a parallel course, a hunch guiding Jackson toward a place where a clumsy amateur might arrange a meeting. They cut across a rocky plateau that overlooked the main trail, a place of twisted junipers and deep shadows. Below, they could see the flickering light of a lantern near the wrecked wagon, where other hands from the ranch were already tending to a bruised but furious Marcus. Guided by Jackson's intimate knowledge of the land, they found what they were looking for near the mouth of an old, abandoned silver mine. 2 horses were tethered in a thicket of mesquite, and in a small clearing, lit by a single, shielded lantern, were 3 figures. 2 were the rough-looking drifters Elena had seen Abigail speaking with in the alley after the proposal. The third, his back to them, was Conrad Webb. Jackson dismounted, signaling for the others to do the same. They crept forward, using the rocks and shadows for cover, until they were close enough to hear. "It is done," one of the drifters was saying, his voice a low growl. "We smashed the axle and threw the goods into the canyon, left a double C brand burned onto the wagon seat, just like your mother said. Now, where is our gold?" Conrad laughed, a high, nervous sound. "My mother is a genius. By morning, the whole territory will believe Cole's men are nothing but common thieves. He will be disgraced." He reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. "Here, now get out of this territory and do not come back." As Conrad handed over the pouch, a sudden, brilliant white light exploded in the clearing, freezing the 3 men in a silent, ghostly tableau. It was followed by a soft, percussive pop and the acrid smell of burnt magnesium. Hank stood from behind a rock, a new plate already in his hand, his movements methodical and calm in the stunned silence. "I hate night photography," he grumbled to no one in particular, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Only a ghost would stand still long enough for a decent exposure. The drifters, reacting first, drew their pistols, but before they could fire, Jackson stepped out of the shadows, his rifle leveled. "Drop them," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge that promised lethal consequences. The pistols thudded to the ground. Conrad stared, his face a mask of disbelief and terror, the empty saddlebag still in his hand. It was then that they heard the sound of another approaching wagon. A moment later, Abigail Webb appeared, Sheriff Harlan at her side, his face a miserable portrait of a man following orders. "There!" Sheriff Abigail cried, her voice triumphant as she pointed a gloved finger. "There is Jackson Cole, caught meeting with the very men who just robbed a supply wagon. Arrest him." Her triumph died in her throat as she took in the scene. She saw her son, pale and trembling. She saw May Cole standing beside a tall, grim-looking priest, Father O'Rourke, who must have ridden with them, and she saw the lanky journalist holding up a thin, glass plate. "This is a fine piece of work, Sheriff," Hank said, squinting at the plate. "A bit blurry, but you can clearly see Mr. Webb here, handing a pouch of what I assume is gold to these 2 gentlemen. I would call it evidence. What would you call it? Father." "A sin being brought into the light," Father O'Rourke said, his voice resonating with a quiet, sad authority. Elena, who had been watching from the shadows, felt a pang of something like pity for Conrad. He looked so young, so lost, a pawn in his mother's vicious game. She moved to Jackson's side. "He is just a boy," she whispered. "Maybe there is another way." Jackson looked down at her, his face hard but not unkind. Forgiveness is not the same as hiding the truth. "Elena, he has to answer for what he did. So does she." May, who had been listening, looked at Hank's glass plate. "You say ghost," she said, her voice dry as dust. "I say Exhibit A for the court." Sheriff Harlan looked from the photographic plate to Abigail's face, which had crumpled into a mask of pure hatred, and then to his largest creditor's son, who was now weeping openly. The web of power that had held him captive for so long had been torn apart by a single, brilliant flash of light. For the first time, the path of his duty was also the path of least resistance. He drew a deep, shaky breath, and the law, for once, found its voice in Santa Lucia. "Conrad Webb," he said, his own voice surprising him with its firmness. You are under arrest." Abigail Webb made a strangled sound in her throat. She looked from her sobbing son to the cold, unforgiving face of Jackson Cole, and then to the glass plate in the photographer's hand. A perfect, undeniable image of her final, failed scheme. It was a negative, a picture of shadows and light, a piece of darkness that held the shape of the truth for the first time in her life. Abigail Webb was utterly, completely, and irrevocably silent. The makeshift courtroom was the old town treasury, a squat, solid adobe building with barred windows and a heavy iron door. It smelled of old paper, dust, and the faint, metallic scent of money long since spent. It was not a place of comfort, but today, it was a place of consequence. The entire town of Santa Lucia seemed to be crammed inside, sitting on long, rough-hewn benches brought over from the saloon. The air was thick and still, heavy with the weight of a community waiting to pass judgment, this time on itself as much as on the accused. A jury of 12 had been impaneled, a cross-section of the territory's soul, 6 ranchers with calloused hands and sun-squinted eyes, and 6 miners, their faces still pale from their time underground. They were men who understood hard work, hard luck, and the simple, brutal difference between right and wrong. A circuit judge, a weary, patient man named Elias Thorne, had been summoned to preside, his presence lending a formal gravity to the proceedings. Conrad and Abigail Webb sat beside a slick lawyer from a larger city, a man whose polished shoes seemed entirely out of place in the dusty room. On the other side sat Jackson and Elena, with May and Hank, the journalist, beside them. Sheriff Harlan stood near the door, a study in official misery, his newfound spine looking as brittle as old parchment. The hearing began, not with legal maneuvering, but with the plain-spoken testimony of honest men. Marcus described the attack on his wagon, his voice still shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. Then Hank took the stand. He explained the science of his box camera with a dry, academic precision, and then he produced a print from the glass plate negative. He held it up for the jury to see. There, in stark black and white, was the scene at the old mine. The image was undeniable, Conrad Webb, his face a ghostly white in the magnesium flash, handing the pouch of gold to the 2 drifters. A collective murmur went through the crowd. It was one thing to hear a story. It was another to see the truth captured by light itself. Jackson was called next. He did not speak of his own heroism or Elena's. He spoke only of the evidence. He described finding the silver lighter in the ashes of the schoolhouse, holding it up for the judge to see. The initials, C.W., glinted in a stray sunbeam. Then he looked at the jury. He asked them to recall the morning the town's flood relief money had been declared stolen. He asked them to remember who had first cast suspicion, and upon whom. Then, Judge Thorne called for Elena Alvarez. She walked to the stand, her steps steady, her head held high. She did not look at the jury or the crowd, but at Conrad Webb. "I saw you the day you came to the ranch with the other men," she said, her voice clear and calm. "The day Mr. Cole guaranteed their loans. I saw the mud on your boots. It was a deep red clay. I had seen it before, on my own shoes, from the ground behind the granary." Conrad, who had been maintaining a shaky composure, flinched as if struck. His lawyer shot to his feet with an objection, but Judge Thorne waved him down. "The witness will continue." That was the last piece of testimony directly related to the crimes. But Jackson's lawyer, a quiet, methodical man from the territorial capital, had one more witness. He called Sarah, Toby's mother. She walked to the stand, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. "They ask you," the lawyer said gently, "to tell the court what you saw Miss Alvarez do during the flood." Sarah looked not at the lawyer, but at Elena. "She saved my son," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The rest of us, we were panicking. We were useless, but she was calm. She saw what needed to be done. She directed the men. She was the one who thought to use the log and the rope. My boy is alive today because of her. Is that the act of a corrupting influence? Is that the heart of a thief? The question hung in the hot, stuffy air. It was the question the entire town had been avoiding for months. Judge Thorne turned his weary eyes to Conrad. "Son," he said, his voice not unkind, "you have heard the testimony. You have seen the photograph. I think it is time for you to tell us your side of this." Conrad looked at his mother, his eyes wide with panic. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Abigail Webb rose to her feet, her composure finally shattering. "He is just a boy," she cried, her voice a shrill, cracking thing. "You cannot do this to him. He was led astray. Everything I did to protect him. I did it out of love." A heavy silence fell over the room. It was Father O'Rourke who broke it. He stood from his place in the crowd, his presence filling the room with a quiet, moral authority. "You speak of love, Mrs. Webb," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, sorrowful power. "And no one here doubts a mother's love for her son. But let me ask you this. In all of your actions, in all of your plans to protect him by destroying another, did you have any love for this town? Did you have any love for your neighbors?" Abigail stared at him, her mouth agape. The question was a spear, and it had found its mark. She had no answer. Her love was a selfish, hoarding thing, a love that saw the world only as a resource for her own needs. Her silence was a confession, a final, damning admission of her own moral bankruptcy. In that moment, everyone in the room saw her not as a pillar of the community, but as the agent of its near destruction. Seeing his mother's last defense crumble, Conrad finally broke. The truth came out in a torrent of sobs and half-formed sentences, a pathetic, ugly flood of its own. The gambling debts, he confessed, were worse than anyone knew. He had stolen the town's gold to pay them off, certain he could replace it before it was missed. But then the floods came early, and the money was needed. He had panicked. "And whose idea was it?" Judge Thorne asked gently, "to place the money on Miss Alvarez's porch?" "It was my mother's," Conrad whispered, his head bowed in shame. "She said no one would ever believe me, but they would believe anything of an outsider. She said it was the perfect solution." The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The final lie was exposed. The hearing was, for all intents and purposes, over. The jury did not even leave the room. They huddled together for a few moments, their voices a low murmur, and then their foreman, a grim-faced rancher, stood up. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Judge Thorne delivered the sentence swiftly. The two drifters were given long prison terms. For Conrad, because of his youth and his confession, the sentence was lighter. He was to repay every cent, perform a year of hard labor for the town's benefit, and then he was to be exiled from the territory for a period of 5 years. For Sheriff Harlan, the judge delivered a blistering public reprimand for his cowardice and dereliction of duty, a shame that would follow the man for the rest of his days. As for Abigail, there was no legal crime with which to charge her, but her sentence, delivered by the silent, accusing eyes of her neighbors, was perhaps the harshest of all. She was an outcast in the very community she had sought to rule. As the crowd filed out of the stuffy treasury and into the clean, bright sunlight, the atmosphere was not one of triumph, but of a quiet, somber relief. The sickness had been purged. The healing could now begin. The first step came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Gable, the old woman who sold honey cakes at the market, approached Elena, a large, cloth-covered basket in her hands. She stopped in front of Elena, her face a roadmap of regret. I was one of them who turned their back on you," she said, her voice trembling. "I was afraid. I am so sorry. I hope you will accept these." She lifted the cloth, revealing a basket piled high with fresh, golden honey cakes. Elena took the basket, her own eyes filling with tears. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you." Then Father O'Rourke was there, a genuine, warm smile on his face. He looked at Jackson and Elena. "I believe there was talk of a wedding," he said. "I would be deeply honored to perform the ceremony this Sunday, if you will have me." Jackson looked at Elena, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small, happy nod. "We would like that very much." "Father," Jackson said. He looked around at the small clusters of men, at Marcus and the other ranchers he had helped, all of whom were now looking at their own boots, shifting their weight, the very picture of awkward contrition. He saw them glance at Elena, wanting to say something, but not knowing the words. A rare, dry smile touched Jackson's lips. He looked at the group of shuffling men, his voice just loud enough for them to hear. "Anyone here need a lesson on how to apologize properly?" he asked. "First one is free." A ripple of surprised, relieved laughter went through the men. The tension broke. The healing had begun, not with a grand gesture, but with a small, shared moment of grace and humor. From across the square, the chapel bell began to ring, not with the frantic alarm of a flood, but with the slow, steady, peaceful cadence of the evening call to prayer. Its voice was clear and true, washing over the town, a promise of forgiveness and new beginnings. In the distance, the arroyo was a dark, damp scar on the land. The waters gone, the earth ready to grow again. The wedding was not an event for the town, but for the family the town had become. It was held on the wide porch of the Double C Ranch House as the sun began its slow descent, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of rose and pale orange. Elena wore the simple cream-colored cotton dress May had helped her finish, its only adornment a sash of pale blue ribbon. On her finger, the heavy iron ring Jackson had given her felt solid and real, an anchor in a world that had finally stopped spinning. There was no grand procession, only the quiet gathering of friends. Marcus and Sarah were there with their children, their presence a testament to a debt of gratitude that would never fade. The ranch hands stood in a clean, awkward line, their hats in their hands, their face scrubbed and earnest. Even Hank, the journalist, was there. His cynical squint softened, his box camera set aside for once. Father O'Rourke, his robes a stark white against the rustic wood of the porch, led the simple service, his voice filled with a gentle, profound joy. They exchanged their vows as the late afternoon light turned golden. The words simple, direct, and unbreakable. When Jackson slid the iron ring back onto her finger, he held her hand for a long moment, his thumb stroking her knuckles, a quiet promise that went deeper than words. The feast that followed was a celebration of community. Long tables were laden with smoked brisket, beans, and Mrs. Gable's honey cakes, which she had insisted on providing. Gifts were not placed on a fancy table, but inside a large, clean wooden bucket with a lid, a practical and humble repository for the offerings of friends, a hand-stitched quilt, a set of iron skillets, a jar of preserved peaches. As twilight settled, a ranch hand with a surprisingly gentle touch drew a slow, sweet melody from an old fiddle. Jackson, his bandaged hands now healed to a tender pink, took Elena's hand and led her onto the porch. They began to waltz, their movements slow and a little clumsy, a quiet rhythm all their own. The others watched, their faces soft in the lantern light. The music drifted out into the cooling air, and the setting sun caught the flanks of the horses in the corral, making their coats gleam like polished copper. It was a moment of perfect, unadorned peace. In the days and weeks that followed, the promises of that evening took root and began to grow. The change in Santa Lucia was not loud or dramatic, but it was real and it was deep. Apologies came not in words, but in actions. People started to look each other in the eye again. The sick poison of suspicion had been leached from the soil. Elena's school opened, not in the rebuilt sheepfold, but in a small, sturdy, sun-dried brick house that Jackson had built for her at the edge of the ranch, close enough for the town's children to reach easily. It was her own domain, a place of light and learning that quickly became the new heart of the community. Her quiet competence and unwavering kindness made her not just a teacher, but a confidant and a pillar of strength. The woman who had been shunned was now the person to whom others turned for advice and comfort. Jackson, for his part, seemed to have found the missing piece of his own soul. The silent, solitary rancher was gone, replaced by a man who smiled more, who spoke with a quiet warmth, and who seemed to find a deep contentment in the simple act of building a life with the woman he loved. He undertook a project of his own, constructing a long, covered porch off the side of the main ranch house, complete with laundry basins and long lines for drying clothes in the sun. It became a gathering place for the women of the ranch and the surrounding area, a place to work and talk, a place where no one was ever made to feel unwelcome. It was his quiet form of justice, a physical structure built to ensure that no woman would ever be cast out again. May, too, found her role in the community transformed. The respect she had always commanded quietly was now spoken aloud. Her knowledge of folk medicine and her steady hand in a crisis were sought after more than ever. She was no longer just the rancher's sister in the background. She was the respected healer, her wisdom valued as much as any formally trained doctor. Even Abigail Webb found a new and wholly unexpected path. She resigned from all of her committees and, after a long, private conversation with Father O'Rourke, began to perform quiet acts of public service. She could be seen tending the small church garden or mending clothes for the poor, her face stripped of its pride, her hands, for the first time, engaged in the humble work of penance. The town, in its own quiet way, learned to forgive, if not to forget. One cool, clear morning in the spring, Elena walked with Jackson down to the corral where his favorite mare, a beautiful palomino named Esperanza, had given birth during the night. The foal, a perfect long-legged replica of its mother, stood on shaky legs, nuzzling its mother's side. Hope, Elena thought, was always being born anew. She stood beside the fence, leaning against Jackson's solid strength, and watched the mare and her foal. The wind, the high desert's constant companion, was blowing, just as it always did. It stirred her hair and whispered through the dry grass, but it felt different now. "I'm not afraid of the wind anymore," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Jackson looked down at her, his arm tightening around her. "The wind still blows," he said, his voice a low rumble. Yes, she agreed, a small smile on her face. But it does not sting so much. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch of their own small cabin, watching the last of the purple light fade from the sky, Elena twisted the iron ring on her finger. It was dark and plain, but to her, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. She smiled, a slow, happy smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "The town once shunned the person I was," she said quietly, her gaze meeting his. "A rich cowboy saw only my heart, and he made me his wife." He did not say anything, but his eyes held all the love and respect in the world. He took her hand, and together they stood up and began to walk along the fence line, their shadows long in the fading light. Behind them, the lights of the ranch house glowed with a warm, steady promise. The tragedy was over. The peace had begun. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night. Like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.